Hi, boys and girls. Today we are going to be working with equations with squares and cube roots. So you'll notice our note format looks a little different today. It's in a program called Prezi. You'll see that at the bottom right-hand corner of the page, Prezi. And so we're going to just look at it a little differently, but you just follow along on your notes, and I think you're going to be in good shape. What you're seeing right now is kind of an overview, and then we'll go inside of each of the bubbles and then do some extra practice. So equations with square roots and cubed roots. Also, your I can statement today is I can solve equations with perfect square and cube roots in the form x squared is equal to p and x cubed is equal to p. All that means is that you're going to be trying to solve for x in both cases. So let's look at our first bubble. We see that inside of the light bulb we see the word questions, but here we go to our first bubble. To clear the ink before I can go to the bubble. There we go. So we see square root equations. So far you have been looking at problems sort of like this. So let's start off just to kind of work with you. Whoa, go back. And then I need some ink. I'll be talking to myself through this. It's going to just be a little different. So you've been doing problems like this, like 5 squared is equal to 25. You know that. So when it says x squared is equal to 25, ultimately what you're trying to do is find what is the value of our x. Well, you already know that it's 5, but it's really important that you are going to prove it. And the way you're going to prove that is to follow this direction here, which says take the square root of both sides. Just like when you're solving an equation, we've already worked with one-step equations this year, and you know that when you're solving an equation, whatever you do to one side to solve, you have to do to the other. That's exactly what we're working with today. So if we're going to solve this equation, which it is, then we're going to take the square root of both sides. In other words, you see, take the square root of the left, take the square root of the right. All that's left on the left, because if I have the square root of x squared, what that's asking is, what do you multiply by itself to get x squared? Well, that value then is going to be x. And then on the right, remember that with square root, our answer is always going to be positive and negative when we talk about a positive square root, because we know that that 5 times 5 is 25, but that also negative 5 times negative 5 is 25. So your final answer is going to be x is equal to positive or negative 5. So the big point here is to make sure that you have written square root on both sides of the equation. I have to wait for this to go away that I can click on it again. All right, now we're back to our original screen, and our next slide is going to be over here to the right where it says x squared is equal to negative 9. All right, so I know if I want to solve this equation, then I see that it's x squared. To do that, I have to take the square root of both sides of the equation. So we take the square root of x squared, which is always going to be x, and we take the square root of negative 9, well, then we kind of have a problem here. I can't multiply anything by itself and get a negative 9. This is what I mean. Because remember, a square, it has to be the same number times the same number. So I can't take a positive 3 and a negative 3. It has to be 3 times 3 or negative 3 times negative 3. So this one actually does not have a solution. I was thinking it was going to come up and say no solution, but it's not happening. All right, but you get the idea. All right, so now back to our home screen. So that tells us how to work square root equations. Now let's go to cubes. Let's talk about what to do when we're solving a cube. So we're going to go to this top left cubes bubble. Take the cube root of each side. So we're trying to solve for x. That's ultimately our goal. So we're going to take the cube root this time of both sides. Since it's x cubed, then we're going to say the cubed root of x cubed, and then we're going to say the cubed root of 8. So all you're going to do is what you know as a square root symbol, but then just put the 3 out in front of it. So the cubed root of x cubed is x. And then the cubed root of 8, that's the question we're asking ourselves of, what do I multiply by itself 3 times to get 8? So just kind of a side note, if you need a little pencil and paper work, 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 gives us 8. So our answer then would be the 2. Now, does it have to be positive or negative? No, because if I chose positive or negative 2, positive 2 we know works. We just did that. But if I did negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, that gives me a negative 8. So that does not check. So remember that the rule is going to be a little different when we're talking about square roots as opposed to cube roots. So x is equal to 2 is our final answer. You should not be using a calculator, and your equal signs should be lined up. All right, team, moving right along. Now we have x cubed is equal to negative 125. So let me go ahead and blow that bubble up for us. And I'm going to show the work of taking the cubed root of both sides. So the cubed root of x cubed is x, and then I want the cubed root of negative 125. So I have to think about, what do I multiply by itself to get 125? Well, I know that 5 times 5 is 25, 5 times 5 times 5 is 125, but this is a negative 125. So is that possible? It's not possible with square roots, but it is possible with cubed roots. So instead of a positive 5, our answer is going to be a negative 5, and I'll show you how to check that. Make sure your equal signs are lined up. There's our answer. So what do I mean by that? So that's negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. 25 times negative 5 is negative 125. We did a great job on that. Final answer. All right, so just to finish up the notes, there are 2 examples that I want you to work through, and then once you have worked through them, then go ahead and try to check your answer. And I'll be working that through. So right now, just pause your video, do the problems, and then when you're finished with the next 2, and you can see those on your PowerPoint, it says more practice, x squared plus 3 is equal to 172, x cubed minus 15 is 49. Go ahead and work through those. Make sure you show your work of how to get there. When you're finished, then go ahead and continue the video. All right, so you should have taken some time to do the 2 problems. If you didn't know how to do it, then just follow along with me. I'm going to write the problems out here to the left just so that you can see the original problem. I want you to see the process that you're going to take, because process is so important. I don't want you just to say x is equal to blah. I want you to show me how you got there. And if you didn't know how to do that, let's just go through this together. When you do a one-step equation, the idea is to isolate the variable or get it by itself. We know that. Well, it's exactly the same thing if it's an x squared. We want to isolate x squared or get it by itself. So to do that, we're going to subtract 3 on both sides of the equation. That leaves x squared on the left, and that is going to give me 169 on the right. line up your equal signs, x squared is equal to 169. But I'm not solving for x squared, I'm solving for x. So in order to get x by itself, then we know that the opposite operation of a square is to find the square root. So the square root of x squared is x. And then we have to stop and say, is the answer going to be just positive 13, just negative 13, or both? If you're not sure, then you can kind of do your little pencil paper down here. 13 times 13, oh yeah, that's 169 for sure. And then is it true that a negative times a negative is also a positive? Absolutely. So our final answer then is x is equal to positive or negative 13. And then our next example, now instead of a square, we have a cube. And I rewrote the problem so we can see the process. We want to get x cubed by itself. Well, how do I do that? I'm going to get rid of a negative 15 by adding 15 to both sides. So I end up with x cubed is equal to 64. We're not solving for x cubed, we're solving for x. So to do that, we're going to take the cubed root of not just the left, but also the right. And here's what it looks like. You're just going to put that little 3 out in front of, you're just going to use a square root bar and then put the little cube out in front of it. And then that tells us the cubed root. Well, the cubed root of x cubed is x. And then we have a decision to make about 64. We're thinking, what do I multiply by itself 3 times to get 64? Well, 3 times 3 times 3 is 27, so it must be 4. Before you circle your answer, consider, is this supposed to be a positive and a negative or just a positive? Well, if it was a negative, then that would give us a negative 64. We don't want a negative 64. We want a positive 64. The same rules do not apply for squares and cubes. So just remember that as you are approaching your final answer. That's going to do it for solving equations with squares and cubes.